friends. It's another week and another video. And this week I have my friend Austin talking about the differences between school psychology and clinical psychology. So enjoy that, and I'll see you guys on Thursday. Peace.
Hey there, my name's Austin, and I'm in the clinical psychology program with Tanisha, and she asked me to make this video comparing, some of the aspects of school psychology to some of the aspects of clinical psychology, and so here I am. I'm going to do my best. I just wanted to know up front, I am going to talk about, sort of my view of the field mostly based on my personal experience. I was in a clinical psychology program now, but previously I was in a school psychology program for a year until I switched into clinical psychology. And I'll talk a little bit about why I decided to change fields, and then also a little bit about the fields broadly, how they compare. So all of this is mostly based on my experiences, and it's been a long time since I have been in the meat of the field of school psychology. I still have a lot of friends from the program that are school psychologists, or almost finished with their training in the PhD program. So I'm still a little bit connected to the field, but so some of this stuff might be a little outdated even. Fields change a lot, and so again, this is just kind of my experiences that I've had with the field, sort of broadly. And then also keep in mind that a lot of the stuff that I might say comparing the two that may seem different, or none of it is clinical psychologists only do this, school psychologists only do this. There's a lot of overlap between the two fields, and so I don't want anyone to think that I'm being very absolute about these differences, because there's obviously a lot that can be similar or different between the fields depending on what you're doing. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm also super nervous, in case you can't tell, so bear with me. School psychology, generally my experience is that there's two broad schools of thought, that are differing schools of thought in school psychology. So one of them is what most people think of when they think of school psychology. So you might think of a psychologist in the schools that's doing a lot of testing, a lot of assessments. They're going to do things like IQ assessments, achievement testing, achievement assessments, and their primary role is going to be their involvement in identifying learning disorders, identifying concerns about learning specifically, and being involved in special education determination. Who gets or doesn't qualify for special education in the schools, and then they may be involved in some groups or some interventions, some smaller interventions and things like that. This school of thought is going to primarily, when they think of like learning disorders, they're going to look at your cognitive ability. What can you do versus like what are you doing in the class, to sort of make that diagnosis. There's another school of thought that's more, it's based more on this concept of RTI, which is response to intervention. And so it's more of a behavioral approach. They're talking about, if you do some assessments and you see that a kiddo is having trouble identifying like letter sounds or something like that, instead of, worrying about the IQ and is there a discrepancy, can we call this a learning disorder, they're just going to start doing a reading intervention. And if it helps the kiddo, that's great. And if it doesn't help, then they're going to increase the intensity of that intervention. And then eventually, when you see if the intervention is or isn't working, then they'll think about making a diagnosis. And so their approach is a little less on diagnosis and more on some early intervention. They're also going to do more school-wide, classroom-wide work in terms of helping teachers manage classrooms and things like that. And they may be more directly involved in interventions, so like doing the interventions themselves. And then they're also, they're still going to play a role in the special education determination. It's just a slightly different way of getting there, I think. Both of these, school psychology sort of frameworks or ideas are going to include things like teaching, teacher in-service days, things like that. They might give some presentations about topics for, teacher professional development. They're both going to be part of special education, a really key role in special education and those services being provided. And then they're both going to be involved in doing assessments and report writing. And I get the sense, at least when I was initially in the field, that in the schools, primarily what you're going to see is more of that first component, although RTI is starting to become more and more popular. So that could be different than when I was, in the field. In terms of the different degrees that you can get, so school psychology is the only, I think I have this right, is the only field of psychology where you don't need a PhD to be considered a psychologist. So in school psychology, or in clinical psychology, you have to get a PhD to be considered or a PsyD or a doctorate degree in order to be considered a clinical psychologist per se, or to get licensed as one. But in school psychology, you can get a master's degree, and then there's an internship process, and then after that, you can get licensed as a psychologist to work in schools. And then, of course, so that's one route, and those psychologists are generally the ones that are going to be in the schools, working closely with students and teachers. And then there are PhD programs for school psychology, and you go into those programs. You might leave doing research. You might be more administrative or more sort of district-wide in your role in schools, or you might be doing research in academia, teaching the next generation of school psychologists, right? And then in terms of differences between clinical psychology and school psychology, one of the main differences, I would say, is sort of what you focus on. And so the majority of the time, the school psych's work is going to be focused on how is, some concern, emotional concern, behavioral concern impacting that child's education. Whereas I think that in clinical psychology, we usually are a little more broad in how is that impacting them in many facets of their life. That's not to say, like I prefaced at the beginning, that's not to say that one is not sort of involved in the other. They certainly are. I think another difference that I have noticed, or that I've maybe picked up on, is the who you work with can be different. So I think naturally, right, school psychologists are going to work more with teachers. They're going to work more with the kiddos one-on-one, and they're going to work with their parents some. Parents will come to meetings and stuff, but I get a sense from friends in the field and stuff too that it's hard to engage parents from when you're in the school. It's sometimes hard to engage parents. It can be a difficult challenge. And then, you might hear from a pediatrician. Sometimes they make recommendations and things like that. Whereas in clinical psychology, you're going to work more directly with the child and family together. And you might consult teachers. You might ask teachers for rating forms, things like that. You might help the parents in navigating the school system. And then depending on the setting, you might have more contact with pediatricians. And so, for example, if you're in primary care setting, you're going to have a lot of contact with pediatricians in clinical psychology, which is another sort of difference between clinical psychology and school psychology is the settings that you're going to be involved in. So it's primarily for school psychologists, they're going to be in schools, or they're going to be in academia, higher education. Clinical psychologists may be more broad. They might be in primary care, higher education, private practice, other groups, academic medical centers, things like that. That's not to say that you can't be a school psychologist and work in an academic medical center or a hospital or a more medical setting or things like that. You certainly can. Actually, I have a friend who was getting her PhD in school psychology, and she, what she wants to do, at least last I knew, she wanted to work in a children's hospital, sort of, in their psych unit, and work with kiddos and how they are reintegrated into school after a stay there. And so that's, as a school psychologist, going to have a lot of really specific knowledge that's going to be important there. And I think that's a really awesome thing, and something that's likely really needed. And so that's, one example of how you can sort of shift, be a school psychologist but involved in other settings outside of schools. And then I think kind of another last main difference here is that sort of your framework for making diagnoses or, getting services in place is different. So in clinical psychology, we use the DSM, right? It's got hundreds and hundreds of diagnoses that we can use. School psychologists are going to focus on 13 categories that are outlined in the IDEA legislation, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. I think that's it. Anyway, so there are 13 categories, and it's going to include some things that sound familiar, like autism, learning disorders, but it also includes things like blindness, deafness, and other kinds of more medical things as well that can impact education. They're going to focus on how things are impacting education to be placed in those sort of categories. For example, and this is somewhat different, and then how we do things in clinical psychology. And so, for example, like a clinical psychologist can diagnose ADHD, they'll diagnose ADHD in kiddos with ADHD in a school setting. With a school psychologist, they might acknowledge that there's ADHD, but that's going to fall under the category of other health impairment, which is kind of a catch-all category. And saying that, they won't make a diagnosis of ADHD necessarily, but they can understand that that is playing a role in the child's education and that they need special education services because of that. Another sort of difference is, if a child is experiencing a mood disorder, and maybe this involves some acting out behavior or something like that, school psychologists would place that, assuming there's evidence and everything, into the category of emotional disturbance rather than labeling it, one of the mood disorders or something like that, like depression or anxiety, even though the child may have been diagnosed with that. That's not how the school psych is going to necessarily conceptualize it, if that makes sense. So some differences there too in sort of the overall framework that we use. And then I think similarities, at the broader level, you use the same sort of broad guiding principles of child development, right? Your base knowledge is still going to be involved in that, or still going to involve that. Things like evidence-based treatment, right? All of these things, when you're doing interventions, evidence-based assessments, all of those things are going to be similar between clinical psychologists and school psychologists. So in a way, we speak similar, technical language, and in other ways we don't. And then, obviously school psych, you're going to focus a lot more on kiddos and teens, and not all clinical psychologists have those aspirations. But broadly, you're still able to work with the individuals in that. So that's another similarity, is that you're able to get some of those direct experiences working with someone. And then I think just overall, I would say, if someone is interested in school psychology, interested in clinical psychology, and what are the differences, asking a lot of people, finding people that are in those fields. I'm always happy to help connect people with people in the field, one way or the other. Can also be a listening ear. Personally, I have made that decision, and that was just, I wanted to be more broad, and I wanted to work in more like primary care settings, and I just didn't see that as an opportunity as a school psychologist. And that's why, once I decided that's what I wanted to do, that's why I made the choice to move out of school psychology. And so, I have some experience I could talk about that too. So, definitely, you can take a chance too. There's always room to get to where you want to be. Even if you decide late in your career, maybe you're already a school psychologist and you want to transition to a different kind of setting, there are opportunities to do that, I would say. So yeah, I hope that the video isn't too long or too short, and I hope that people got something out of it. So it was great to do this, and good luck, and